Hello everyone, welcome to Starscream's Ghost, a Transformers podcast, your episode-by-episode podcast guide through the classic Transformers Generation 1 cartoon, then the Headmasters anime series, and now, my good friend in crime, Mr. Andy Hanley, we're delving into comics. And welcome back to the podcast, everyone. It's been a little while since we did our last episode concluding Headmasters, which you can go back and hear about in the archives, which I'll elaborate on in a few moments. But Andy, we're moving into the comics realm. It's exciting.
Yeah, we are. I mean, it's an exciting time in general. Like, they're rebooting G1 Transformers in comic form, and that's always an interesting time. So yeah, it's kind of nice to be here at ground zero, as it were, for that.
Yeah, because at the time we're recording this, it's the 15th of October, and I think it's been out for about a week or so now, if memory serves. So a little bit of time for the dust to settle. We've got some interesting sort of facts and trivia that we can touch on as well. But before we get to that, folks, if you're a first-time listener, thank you very much for giving the podcast a try, and we hope you enjoy it. If you want to delve into our, quite frankly, enormous archive in terms of length of podcast at this point, you've got over 50 episodes, if you include the bonus episodes, to delve through. We've covered all of the original G1 series from seasons 1 to 4. We've also just wrapped up on the Japanese Transformers Headmasters series. And let's call it like it is. We're pretty good at least try Super God Master Force at some point. But that will wait till nearer the end of the year, as it were. But today, we are going to be talking about the new Transformers comic. And if you want to find our website, which has the links to all the podcast providers you may have found us on, as well as our YouTube channel, where every single episode of the podcast is housed, and you can find some clips on there as well, starscreamspod.com is the place to go. So Andy, in a weird way, there's a lot to talk about in different sort of strands of a conversation, but for the purposes potentially of our brand new listeners who may be delving into this because we're touching on a new Transformers comic, I think we should kind of do a little bit of a recap from something that we touched on in the very first episode of the podcast. That being our personal histories with the Transformers comics. Now, previously I have detailed that, honestly, I've not read a lot of Transformers comics, and that's not for not wanting to, it's kind of more a question of time and such, and when I was growing up, I really was only exposed to the cartoon specifically, so wasn't even really aware that there were comics until much later on. And I've dabbled in a few of the comics here and there from the IDW range. It was when they had the two series side by side. It was More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise, I think it was. Yeah. Sort of dabbled into a little bit of those and such, and you bought me the Last Bot Standing comic, which I've delved into as well, obviously, but other than that, never really delved into much more, and perhaps some of the classic compilations you also got me as a present, come to think of it, so thank you once again for that. But sort of delved into those, as it were, but I've never gone full in, as it were, on Transformers comics. But as we've talked about before, and for our refresher point now, a very different scenario from your perspective, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, basically the Transformers comic was everything. Like, that was the starting point. That was kind of like the alpha and the omega, really, of my kind of Transformers fandom. Like, cue sound effect into, like, hazy, misty-eyed nostalgia here. Like, put some video effects in, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, I started with, like, issue 30 of the UK comic. So for the misty-eyed nostalgia part is like, my mum was a nurse. She worked night shifts, and she often like worked weekend night shifts because then my dad was home to like look after me. And so basically, like, let's say it like it is, my Sunday morning bribe each week for being abandoned by one of my parents to do some good, honest work was to, like, buy me something. Like, she'd stop off at the newsagent. Sometimes it'd be a little toy. Sometimes it'd be, like, a comic or a book or, puzzles, colouring book, whatever it was. And mostly those were things that just kind of passed me by, though, just like ephemeral, like, oh, that was a fun thing to have on a Sunday morning. Like, it was a little thing to play with, little thing to read, whatever it was. But one thing stuck with me, and that is issue 30 of the Transformers comic, which was the Decepticon Dam Busters episode, which is basically like, which is kind of sort of in the cartoon as well. Like, they basically, Decepticons are like, hey, we can use a dam to create masses of energy if we basically blow it up. And the Autobots have to kind of like save all the people who are about to get flooded. And I don't know what it was about it specifically, but like I just thought it was the most awesome thing I'd ever seen. Like I think the artwork of that issue was particularly good. Like it was a good, even though I kind of delved in like, you know, pretty mid story at that point. You know, the comic had been running for, you know, a good chunk of time already. So it was like, it was very much in the midst of it, but that was a good kind of standalone little story where you got a feel for like, okay, these are who these two sides are, and, you know, I get it. So it was kind of a good introduction completely by accident. And yeah, I think it was the first time I ever remember where, like, you know, one of these things that my mum had brought home, I was like, oh, there's another issue next week, like, can you get me the next issue? And then I read that, and I think that was like a Dinobot issue maybe, which was just like sealed the deal basically. So by that point it was like, yeah, get me the next issue. Before I knew it, I had a subscription, like back in the good old days where you'd have a subscription with the newsagent, and so, you know, they would just come, you know, you could just go and pick up your comic every week. And that endured. Like I read it through to like issue 200 and something, which was where it all, the readership was declining in general. Like it went from its sort of peak of being a full color comic to a chunk of it was black and white. Clearly it was running down, and, you know, I was kind of growing older and kind of moving on to other things. But yeah, it was a constant. Like, you know, I still have all of those comics in a cupboard somewhere, and have occasionally pulled them out and reread them. Less so now it's available. Well, a chunk of it, not all of it, is available digitally. And yeah, so kind of this was always my canon, really, was the G1, the Marvel UK comic in particular, which, you know, took the US comics, and then because it was weekly, it had to insert its own stories in there, and actually a lot of the UK storylines turned into kind of the most interesting stuff. You know, kind of Simon Furman became sort of a big part of that, and has kind of persisted in Transformers kind of writing and fandom ever since, because he wrote a lot of really cool storylines. And yeah, we've kind of talked about this on the podcast before, and I didn't even really kind of think about it at the time, but the UK comics in particular treated the readers like grown-ups. Like it wasn't just kind of pew pew lasers cartoons. Like it had relatively serious subject matter to it. You know, it went pretty hard on some of its kind of sci-fi conceits of like time travel and stuff like that, which again, as a kid, it was like the first time I really approached any of that kind of material, and so it was actually like a really good grounding for kind of getting into like sci-fi stuff in general. And so yeah, like, you know, I loved the cartoons. Like obviously I thought I loved the toys, they were great, but like the comic was the thing for me for a very long time.
So as you can tell, folks, a very different history with comics.
Yes, yeah. I went long, but yeah, that basically says it all. But like, yeah, like read a lot of Transformers comics, and I would say, like, post that, you know, I've read some of the IDW stuff kind of here and there. Like, you know, there's not really anything that I've consistently stuck with, but, you know, I've read some of the stories in there that have been pretty good. But, you know, it's kind of, like I said, it's exciting to see it getting, you know, another crack at sort of starting over. And kind of recreating the universe to see, you know, what they're going to do this time around.
100%. And you mentioned the word universe, so I think that's a good segue into where we should really start when it comes to discussing this. And that is the background information on what is being termed as the Energon Universe. Now, for those of you not aware, the Energon Universe, and this information I'm taking, by the way, is per the TF Wiki, so full credit to them for what I'm going to be reading. The Energon Universe is the name for the shared universe in which Skybound Entertainment's comic books, featuring licensed properties from Hasbro take place. Launched in 2023, these properties, at the time of recording this podcast, include Void Rivals, which is an original creation in this new universe, then the 2023 Transformers series, and a line of G.I. Joe comics as well. We're going to touch on Void Rivals specifically in a few moments, because there is actually a key element which, funnily enough, Andy, plays directly into the first issue of the comic as well. So we will touch on that in a few moments. But in terms of who is heading and fronting this Energon universe, Robert Kirkman, who people will know as the creator of Invincible, the long-running comic series, has also had an Amazon Prime adaptation, which is actually very good as well if you want to watch something like that. Also, you may have heard of a little comic or a series called The Walking Dead. So in terms of pedigree of establishing big universes and really getting long-form storytelling and such and engaging readers in that sense, got some great pedigree there. And apparently Robert Kirkman began developing this Energon universe in 2021. And this was after Hasbro approached Skybound about taking over the licenses for Transformers and G.I. Joe from the then owner of the rights, IDW Publishing. Wanting to do something unique, Robert Kirkman proposed launching a universe with a new property that would feature a surprise reveal in the first issue, which eventually became the comic we know as Void Rivals. Along with writing Void Rivals, Kirkman is also acting as a sort of showrunner for the rest of the Energon Universe line, with other creators working on the main Transformers and G.I. Joe comics. In a later live stream, Kirkman stated that there are currently no plans to integrate other Hasbro properties into the universe, not that they don't want to, but there is the possibility of integrating more original properties like Void Rivals. And at the time of writing, the current titles announced and have begun releasing, in this Energon universe are Void Rivals, Transformers, and 2 G.I. Joe comics announced, Duke, and Cobra Commander. Even on a concept level, Andy, it's a really cool idea, and the fact that Hasbro were game for this, it's very, very intriguing how this is going to go long term, because we're so early into the life cycle of this.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of feels like the obvious kind of play, like, you know, especially probably even more so around the time of this being conceptualized. You know, everybody was getting big on the idea of a metaverse, of like, oh, you know, a one big universe that has all the things. If anything, I'm surprised that they've already kind of lopped off the idea of like, oh, no plans to have other like Hasbro properties in there. It's like, you know, are we really not having another Transformers My Little Pony crossover? Like, do you really want to shut that door? But shut that door before the horse is bolted, to use the obvious joke. But yeah, I mean, you know, this makes a lot of sense, especially with these two properties. And, you know, like, Transformers and G.I. Joe crossed over in the G1 comics. There's kind of a pretty obvious way you can have those characters sort of share a universe in ways that make sense relatively. I mean, heck, the G1 comics had like Spider-Man in the Transformers universe, so why not? That probably won't happen again, but you know, you never know. To me, the most interesting part of this though is that, like, the idea of tying like a new original property into this. That's the part that I kind of find quite exciting, because that gives a lot of scope to do a lot of interesting things. And you know, we can get into Void Rivals, but it feels like a really interesting jumping off point for what could be a very sort of open-ended opportunity to kind of, you know, explore the universe of the Transformers quite literally, because, you know, it's a lot more kind of spacefaring and less sort of earthbound than maybe like the early Transformers issues will be.
Yeah, and other elements that interest me as well, and I this may have been a comment from later down the line, which we'll get to, but it comes across to me, already having read Void Rivals as well, like I said, we'll be talking about it in a few moments, but it already feels like, while it's not going to be, perhaps, what's the way to phrase this? It's going to have essential moments in that comic that will play on the remainder of the universe, but it's not centrally integral to the entire universe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see how they will handle that, because there is the potential there of kind of becoming off-putting. Like, if you lean too much on all of the properties, you know, interrelating and becoming this kind of tangled web, and start trying to force people like, well, you've got to read the G.I. Joe comic, you've got to read, you know, anything else in this universe for it all to make sense. Like, that's always a danger when you have this kind of concept. I mean, even like, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe at this point, like, I've bailed on, because like there are too many TV shows and other things to watch to fundamentally understand stuff, and it's like, I just want to watch the bits that I want to watch. And it's kind of the same with this, like, you know, I'm not a big G.I. Joe guy. Like, I don't mind reading some bits that are a crossover, but I don't necessarily want to reach the point where it's like, well, you've got to read these 50 issues of another comic to understand what's going on in the Transformers, and, you know, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the danger there. But I think if that's their ploy, that, you know, there will be like key moments where they sort of cross and intermingle, that seems like a good solution to that problem.
Definitely. And an interesting detail which we've not, well, again, I'm trying to think of words here, folks, but IDW officially announced they were losing the license at the end of 2022. I think it was like in very early 2022, if memory serves. And since December last year, as I say, we're recording this for future listeners on the 15th of October, until Void Rivals happened, Andy, there was nothing about what's happening next with these comics. Everything sort of just went out of print, taken offline from the likes of Comixology and stuff. There was no way to buy the comics again unless you could find them in a brick and mortar store or like a second-hand shop or something. So the fact it was just so dormant, and as we're about to get onto it, then just had a stealth launch, it's quite a ballsy move in a way that they didn't try and jump on the fact of, here's what's next, straight after the license had officially ended.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I was expecting them to just sort of drop something out the door kind of almost day one, just to kind of keep people satiated. Because, yeah, I mean, this was very much like a kind of off-camera, off-mic discussions we'd have quite the regular after recording episodes of the show, of just like, they've really not like said anything or announced anything yet. That seems weird. Like, maybe we missed something, and just like trawling the internet, it's like there must be something that somebody has said about like what's happening, or putting a timeline out there or a date on things. But yeah, it was very much a kind of almost radio silence, and then yeah, suddenly, you know, stuff started dropping, which yeah, it's an interesting move for sure.
And a little, as we sort of go into our next topic of discussion, as it were, and it's also just occurred to me, is that the TF Wiki has got its own sort of portal, if you will, for the Energon Universe. I wonder if that means they're going to have to start covering the G.I. Joe comics on the TF Wiki.
I mean, yeah, I imagine there are probably already, I'm sure if you search G.I. Joe on the TF Wiki, there'll be plenty of entries already, so, you know,
why you aren't joking, actually.
Why not?
So with that being said, let's talk about Void Rivals Issue 1. Again, the notes I'm about to read per the TF Wiki. Now, this was the launch of the Energon Universe, as it were, and the overview of the story is as follows. War rages around the Sacred Ring, where the last remnants of the planets Agora and Zertonia have collapsed around a black hole in a never-ending war. However, when Agorian pilot Darak and Zertonian rival Solila, I'm going to say the name is Andy, both crash on a desolate planet, these two enemies must find a way to escape together. But are they alone on the strange planet? That is the overview of the story, but the crucial moment to sort of jump forward a little bit, and we're very much going into spoilers for the first issue now, folks, I will say as well, is the two rivals, quite literally, they have to try and think of a way to get off the planet. Both of their ships are totaled, so they sort of go their separate ways because they're ancient enemies and such. They have respective races of people. And then Solila comes back and says, you need to see what I've just found. And they find the remnants of some kind of craft in a ravine. A ravine, Andy. Flipping heck, I've only just clocked that. Like, the Transformers bingo card returns already. Long-time podcast listeners will get that reference. And they go towards this ship and whatnot, and suddenly they hear noises because they try and activate something. And you see on panel the sound effects of... And then, of all characters, Andy, Jetfire is standing before them. The two characters are just utterly shocked, and Jetfire begins to say some dialogue to himself, sort of wondering how much time has passed. Oh, he's been gone for a while. He should really go back to Cybertron. But the key detail, Andy, is if I remember correctly, he mentions millions. He mentions like 100 years, but then it turns out it's been millions. So a lot of time has passed since Jetfire crash landed on this planet. I absolutely adored the reveal of this, because, truth be told, folks, I've only sort of read this today before we've started recording, but the one image, and I'm sure you can agree, Andy, that has gone around the places is a visual of Jetfire holding the two characters from Void Rivals in the palm of his hand. And so I assumed that's how this issue was going to play out. But it wasn't that at all, and that actually gave me an extra kick of reading this so sort of delayed, if you will, because I think Void Rivals is up to like issue 3 or 4 now at the time of recording. So the fact that that happened and I could still be shocked like that, it was really, really good fun. But another detail as well is that Jetfire did not know where he was. So something has clearly happened amongst whatever happened to him when he crash landed, the amount of time that's passed. Even, I think if I recall, he was also quite surprised at how he was kind of like eroding and was rusting, because that's how long it's been from the planet he's been on. But I absolutely adored this reveal, and also, gotta say, Void Rivals was a good read.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of... It's one of those things I feel like I've been talking about kind of elsewhere on various things, that like it is kind of at that point in time where it's hard to find anything that's particularly entirely new in fiction, because like it feels like every story has been told, and this is one of those cases where it's like, yeah, this is not necessarily a new story with like the rivalry between these two characters, but it's really well done. It plays out really well, like, you know, even out with had there not been a Transformer involved in this, I'd still be like, no, that was a pretty good comic. But yeah, like, it's very good at keeping its powder dry and not being like a Transformers comic until the point where it suddenly is for a bit, and then Jetfire just buggers off basically, and then it kind of isn't again. Which also is a good kind of twist, because you kind of, you know, as a long-standing Transformers person, you're kind of like, okay, well, you know, he's probably going to help them out here. This is, you know, he's going to resolve this situation, and we'll see where this goes. But he's like, no, sorry guys, gotta go. And that's the end of that, which is kind of a twist upon the twist, really. But yeah, it's some good stuff.
Which also makes me wonder as well, that little twist that you've been mentioning. The fact, I'm actually looking at the panel now, actually, as we're recording this. The final lines he basically says is, Cybertron, after all these years, I'm sorry, I have to get home. Then just transforms and leaves the two. Now, Jetfire doesn't know they've been stranded either. So he literally just takes off and flies into space and leaves them. So I wonder down the line of Void Rivals, again, only having read issue 1, if that's going to come back into the story somewhere, because that'll be a fun little twist in some way.
Yeah, you've got to imagine that there's going to be some kind of confluence of events there. But yeah, let's have a moment to feel sorry for poor old Jetfire. In pretty much every continuity, he kind of gets buried for like a million years, and somebody wakes him up and he's very confused. This is just like kind of just his canon now for like pretty much every time he appears in Transformers fiction. He's always having a rough time.
You aren't joking, are you? So now let's get on to Transformers issue 1. The next stage of the Energon Universe. Now, I thought, Andy, the way I'll do this is something a bit different. Again, sort of going to take most of my notes and such from the TF Wiki's synopsis, because that's, quite frankly, that's going to have all the relevant and up-to-date information and stuff. But what I wanted to do before we got to that, Andy, was I went back into the preview timeline, as it were, leading up to the release of this comic. I'm going to read the official synopsis for Transformers issue 1. Then we can delve into it and kind of have a little play around and such based on that. So, here is the official synopsis for Transformers issue 1. Transformers #1 begins an all-new era for the iconic robots in disguise from superstar creator Daniel Warren Johnson. Then they name-check some of the series from the past: Extremity, Do a Powerbomb, and DC's Wonder Woman Dead Earth. And colorist Mike Spicer, noted as having done Stillwater. Optimus Prime was supposed to have led the Autobots to victory. Instead, the fate of Cybertron is unknown. And his allies have crash-landed far from home, alongside their enemies, the Decepticons. As these titanic forces renew their war on Earth, one thing is immediately clear. The planet will never be the same. New alliances are struck, battle lines are redrawn, and humanity's only hope of survival is Optimus Prime. It's a good little teaser for it, isn't it?
Yeah, going big on the Optimus Prime angle, which makes sense when you read the afterwards to this first chapter from the creator. By the way, that is all
100%.
about the Optimus Prime toy was awesome. Also, I lost his hands on a bus, and it's like, yeah, that's a very common like childhood Transformers fond / traumatic memory of I lost a bit of one of my favorite Transformers.
So as we sort of have got that as we have that to set the stage, excuse me. In terms of a synopsis in hindsight, Andy, thoughts, just generally, like thoughts on that synopsis having now read the first issue. Do you think that's very representative, or do you think that was very much a boilerplate? This is just like we need as almost not generic a synopsis as possible, but something that isn't going to give away very much, if anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat accurate. Again, I mean, the thing that kind of sort of stands out somewhat there, and certainly stood out to me from this first chapter, is that it is very kind of Earth / sort of human centric in terms of its perspective. Like, you look at the start of the original G1 comics, because I did go backwards from issue 30 and like, you know, pick up like collections of the first 29 as well. Like, you know, that starts on Cybertron with kind of, you know, a whole mission to get Energon, blah blah blah. Like the G1 cartoon, likewise, you start out on Cybertron and then you see them crash to Earth and then you kind of get into it. So it's kind of interesting that the starting point of this opening chapter, there's no time spent on Cybertron. Like, it's straight in with humans. It's them who find and kind of effectively kick things off with, you know, reinvigorating the Transformers, as it were. So that was kind of notable to me. And yeah, I mean, this opening is very like Optimus Prime centric. Like, he kind of, you know, he looks pretty cool in this chapter. Like, he does cool Optimus Prime things, which yeah is definitely kind of, given that synopsis, that feels like, you know, that's not just maybe an opening salvo. Like, that's probably going to be sort of an intrinsic part of things to come.
Also, from the perspective of us in our podcast timeline, if you will, it's very weird seeing Optimus Prime again, given how many times we've seen him die now.
yeah, and I mean, again, given some of the proclivities of this first chapter, like, I would not be at all surprised if he dies again at some point, to be honest, because this does not feel like a series that's particularly worried about not killing off any of its characters if there's a good reason to.
Yeah, and I think that's really emphasized with the first page of the comic, because we basically get 5 panels, and we have a bunch of military helicopters flying near a sunset. Then we see the Ark flying through space. Then we see someone tending to someone who has been gravely injured in the military. Then we basically see what appears to be a dead Optimus Prime, so already starting off good. And then we get a visual of a spaceship of some kind launching from Earth. And just those 5 panels alone, Andy, it certainly sets a tone for maybe what we're going to be seeing, because the middle 2 panels on that page are basically a grave injury and what seems to be death.
Yeah, and it's doubly interesting / weird, because that seems like that is kind of played in as like a dream sequence, which, again, I mean, this stuff is particularly interesting to me. Like, this is where I get into kind of G1 comics nerd mode, my transformation, if you will, because like there are a couple of things that sort of stand out here. Like, one, that the original kind of Marvel comics, I mean, the main kind of character there is not the main young character there is not Spike. His name is Buster, but there's kind of a slight similarity in the kind of relationship between him and Sparkplug, who is his dad. In that kind of continuity, like, yeah, Sparkplug's a mechanic. He has his own, you know, garage. He wants to hand it down to his son, but his son wants to go to college and do that kind of stuff instead. And there's this kind of like father-son schism that sort of gets repaired somewhat over time by the invasion of the Transformers, basically. So that kind of angle feels sort of like it's been given a fresh coat of paint in this series, because there's that same sort of distance between father and son for slightly different reasons. And one of the other things that the Marvel comic does quite early on is that it kind of makes clear that Sparkplug was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. I think it was Vietnam. It might have been the Korean War. I forget which, but he was a prisoner of war. He'd served time in the military, and he'd seen some things, and it never really went too deep on that because, again, kind of more of a kids comic back then. But you know, again, in terms of that tackling adult subjects, it was pretty clear that he'd seen some traumatic things in wartime, and like that opening page kind of shown as seemingly some kind of sort of dream sequence. It felt like it was maybe leaning on or kind of nodding to a bunch of those things, because the other thing that happens in the G1 comics is that basically at some point, like, Optimus Prime transfers the creation matrix, which is kind of, pre-Matrix of Leadership Transformers, a movie. It's the ability, the knowledge to create new Transformers life is transferred from Optimus Prime's head into Buster's head.
Oh, wow.
Which messes him up. Like, as you might imagine, like, Big Robot Man just transfers his mind into your head. And yeah, like, it does a lot of stuff that's really quite dark at the time. And like, so that was also a thing that I kind of like found myself wondering, is this kind of nudging in some of the same directions? Is there some kind of like weird sort of, psychic link effectively going on here? Or am I just massively overthinking these first few panels of this comic?
So, on to the synopsis, as it were, from the TF Wiki. We can sort of pause and discuss things as needed, Andy. Spike Witwicky finds his father Sparkplug asleep in the bar. Spike asks his father how long he's been there, to which Danny the bartender answers since noon. Sparkplug notices that Spike has his brother Jimmy's telescope with him. Spike tells him that he and Carly were planning to go up to Hangers Rock to look at the full moon. He says it helps him remember Jimmy, to which Sparkplug grouses that it's better to just forget. Spike fires back at his father, telling him that he won't end up like Jimmy. Meanwhile, another patron is drunkenly ranting about how he saw a giant, boxy jet fly down from deep space. Their conversation, though, is soon interrupted by the arrival of Sparkplug's co-worker Davey, who is picking him up for his shifts. Sparkplug tells Spike that he has to grow up eventually, to which Spike angrily asks if he means being like him. A very pointed statement, to say the least. This then, Andy, introduces us to Carly for the first time, because Spike walks outside and we see a van with Carly outside, which has got some amazing artwork on it, it's got to be said. Awesome stuff. And Carly consoles a dejected Spike by suggesting they go, quote-unquote, pretend they're on another planet. Now, just to pause there for a second, Andy, because there's a lot to take in there. The one thing, various things have been established there. In terms of Jimmy, based on like the first panel of the comic, that must be who we're to assume Sparkplug was trying to console, as it were, or trying to help out in that flashback image. But also, it's very clear that things aren't going well for this family, to say the least. Things are not in a good place. Sparkplug is just a drunken mess going to work drunk and such. Spike doesn't have the support, which is actually something that comes into play in later dialogue as well in this comic. In terms of establishing a tone, it's not exactly, let's perk up everything and let's keep going. Chaps, we'll be just fine. It's very much a not good place here.
Yeah. It's sort of the typical thing that, cartoons and comics often do, where you just have like kid discovers the robots as like, wow, this is so cool. Like this is more on like the sort of Mobile Suit Gundam end of the scale of like, oh no, like everything is bad already and it's probably only going to get worse when we get involved with the big robots.
You ain't joking. So the story continues at Hangers Rock, where Carly and Spike climb the mountain in search of a better view and discuss their respective future ambitions. Spike has recently been accepted into the University of California in Berkeley, where he wishes to follow in Jimmy's footsteps and become an astronaut. In fact, Andy, that's just then gone completely against my point, because clearly the rocket ship at the end is where Jimmy was, I guess. So, some clarification is needed as to who Jimmy is, but no doubt that will happen in future issues. And apparently as well, to follow on to this, he's actually reluctant to tell Sparkplug about his ambitions since Jimmy's death. Carly, meanwhile, has been looking at art schools, but she and her father are struggling to make that prospect work financially. Carly takes Spike's hand and basically says how sorry she is about what's going on with his family. The two teenagers lean in closer, and suddenly an earthquake happens. The ground goes out from underneath them, causing the mountain to split open. The two go plummeting into the depths below. Recovering, they find themselves inside a giant circular structure, which it turns out, Andy, is the booster part of the giant spacecraft we know as the Ark, but it's not actually been established as a name at this point in the comic. That visual, when the Ark is first revealed in the side of the mountain, I absolutely loved that. Just that moment of, what the heck is going on? And they pan out to the side of the mountain. You just see the Ark there, and they're in the booster bit. Such a good visual.
Yeah, it's a really cool. Like this chapter has a whole bunch of kind of really good visual moments, but this is definitely like kind of one of the standout ones. It gets practically a full page for a reason. I do have questions as to how nobody noticed the whacking great spaceship in the volcano / mountain before this point, but yeah, we'll let that one slide, I suppose.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of, and maybe this will be elaborated in some sort of post-issue notes and such, but maybe when the earthquake happened, it maybe gave way to a side of the mountain or debris or something.
Yeah,
and
I think yeah, like I think that's the intimation there. But you still imagine some kind of geologist would have been like hanging around the mountain, being like, "There's something strange about this. It's almost like something flew into it a long time ago."
I'm getting a weird reading on my metal detector.
Exactly. Yeah.
But Carly's kind of a bit spooked by this. But Spike, if there's one thing that does continue in terms of character tendencies, Andy, it's the fact that Spike likes to go exploring and perhaps sometimes acts before he thinks. So he ventures further into the spacecraft and manages to stumble upon the main control room littered with mangled bodies of what appear to be some sort of giant robots. Then, linking into what we saw in Void Rivals issue 1, Jetfire then flies into view, lands in the Ark and transforms, grateful to have found his fallen friends. He activates Teletran 1 to repair and reconstruct his fellow Cybertronians, granting them new forms that he found on Earth. But the surprising twist here, Andy, is it's not just Autobots that are inside the Ark, and the first Transformer that is revived is Starscream. And it's at this moment in the comic as a reader where I'm thinking, what direction is this about to go in? Like, there's many ways they could do this. And Jetfire warmly greets his old friend, which is stemming on from like we've seen in the past, Andy, where Jetfire didn't really know where the war was at and such, and who was on what side and wants to be a pacifist and such. But the main thing is, he's not seen Starscream in centuries. Starscream thanks Jetfire for waking him and says that he's glad he, quote-unquote, picked the right side before immediately turning to Bumblebee, whose body is just lying on the ground next to them, and blasts his head off. Just directly in the face. There is no other way to put this, Andy. This was violent as hell.
Yeah. So, somebody involved with this series not a fan of Bumblebee. I'm taking it because I mean, you know, that's quite something. But yeah, I mean, again, this is it's interesting because it's like it's very familiar, but it isn't. Like, you know, this sort of starting point again. The G1 cartoon basically kind of starts from this point, like minus Jetfire. The G1 comic likewise, and so this sort of feels like both very familiar territory, but also something kind of new. And again, it ties into what we just talked about with Void Rivals as well, of just like, okay, well, yeah, Jetfire is not privy to any of the stuff that has clearly gone on in and around the Ark, or any of the wider implications of why all these Transformers are all in one place. And, you know, that becomes kind of a pivotal point, you know, in kind of in a very sort of different turn to sort of other iterations where it's kind of just accidental that the Transformers get reactivated. Here it's a far more deliberate thing, which is, you know, kind of an interesting twist.
This is the point where we come to find out what Jetfire's reaction to this just blatant murder that Starscream has done is, and he's utterly, utterly just stunned. He was unaware that his people have been at war for the past 100 years, and he tries to stop him, but Starscream turns his weapon on his old friend for showing weakness. And Starscream aims his weapon at Jazz next, but then is stopped by a reconstructed Optimus Prime. And it's a great little first moment when you just see the arm appear, if I remember correctly, and you just think, stuff's about to happen now. And boy, is that what happens next, Andy. But just that visual of Optimus Prime just suddenly coming into view in this wonderful moment.
Yeah. There's no real kind of cue in that's what's going to happen. It's your kind of classic intervention moment of just like, he just kind of grabs one of Starscream's lasers and then clobbers him, basically, for want of a better turn of phrase. Which, again, like there's also something that I kind of like about this, and I'm interested to see where this goes, because, again, you look at the sort of, especially the G1 cartoon Starscream, who's very kind of, it's his fault that the Autobots get reactivated in the cartoon, because it's like the Decepticons get reactivated first, and then it's his petulance that ends up causing the Autobots getting their turn. Whereas here, this is a very kind of cold, calculating Starscream, like no messing around. It's just like, okay, I'm just gonna blow all of these guys to bits while I have the chance, and it's only pure luck pretty much that is prevented from happening.
Having just quickly loaded up the comic to find a particular panel when he actually shoots Jetfire in the chest effectively, there's a very interesting line which I'm wondering if this is going to play into something quite significant long term. Because after Starscream has fired at him, and he said, "I'm surprised at you, Jetfire, showing weakness. What a waste." Jetfire responds with, "Starscream, no, this is not what I wanted." And then Starscream, pointing at Jazz, specifically at the Autobot emblem, responds to him by saying, "Trust me when I say, this marking," pointing at the emblem of the Autobots, "is a sign of true evil." That's a very pointed bit of dialogue, Andy, and part of me at that point made me think, is this going to be a shattered glass type thing where the roles are reversed? But based on how events play out, which we'll get to in a few moments, it doesn't seem like it's going to be.
Yeah. Again, this feels very much like a kind of maybe a nod to the G1 cartoon and kind of Jetfire's introduction there, where, the Decepticons. And again, I think this happens in some other mediums as well, where kind of Jetfire is told, like, no, they're the bad guys, like, we're the good guys that are fighting for, what's right. And I mean, again, some of the directions IDW went in were actually kind of quite interesting politically from that point of view, in terms of the starting point, at least, for, like, Megatron's ideas, which was basically like, we should have a union, and then it just turned into kind of like, global intergalactic war.
Oops.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I suspect this felt like maybe a bit of a nod towards that, of, just trying to kind of, blind Jetfire with, or it could just be a genuine, like, that's legitimately what Starscream thinks, that, he's on the right side of this for other reasons. So it's definitely an interesting kind of nugget, because I wonder how, I fully suspect, we're going to go quite deep into the philosophical elements of why these two sides are fighting and what they're fighting for, because that's very much kind of, a modern adult Transformers way of talking about it, of like, it's not just good versus evil, like, there's a reason why this conflict has come to this point, and what is that, like, there's usually something a little bit deeper than just they're the baddies. So I suspect we'll definitely get some of that moving forward.
So we now come at this point to the Autobot leader, and at this point, TF Wiki notes him as the Decepticon warrior, Starscream, which is fair, because there is a notable omission currently, but we'll touch on that shortly. They are fighting, and Prime suddenly notices the humans. Obviously, we know them as Spike and Carly. He doesn't know at this point. And instinctively dives to protect them from Starscream's fire. Starscream's attack is halted, though, by the intervention of another Autobot, and it's Ratchet! Good to see some of the old-timers, as it were, making their appearance. And also, at this moment as well, it turns out Teletran has now reconstructed Skywarp, the Decepticon. So now it's 2v2, just when you thought for a moment it might be a 2v1 situation. At this point, they realize that the computer is randomly reconstructing the Transformers. So Starscream tells Skywarp to bring their fellow Decepticons closer. Optimus Prime realizes at this very moment the Decepticons will soon outnumber them and orders a retreat. And there's a wonderful moment when this happens, Andy, because Prime's been reconstructed now to obviously be more like an Earth vehicle, which we come to know as, a big lorry, a truck with a trailer. And there's a great moment when Optimus Prime is saying, I feel like I'm missing something. Like, there's another part of me. I'm going to just try and find a line of dialogue quickly. But, so yeah, he says, so Ratchet says, just our luck, Decepticons got activated first. Prime says, too many of them have been awakened. We must retreat. Ratchet responds, but our brothers. And then Prime says, my new form. There should be some sort of... Turns around behind him and goes, trailer! You can load our warriors in there. And Ratchet's response was, it'll be tight.
Yeah, I mean, you're not kidding. I mean, I can tell you from owning the toy, I cannot fit any of the full-size Transformers in Optimus Prime's trailer. It's very annoying.
So it was just a fun little moment there, and that's another kind of a nod to established old school Transformers fans of, there's another part of me. What is it?
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering whether this was also going to kind of lead to like Roller being rolled out as well. He was also, I think Roller did get used in the cartoon at some point, I seem to recall.
Very early on. I think it was
Yeah.
in the initial 3 parts of More Than Meets the Eye, if I remember. Maybe one more time after that.
Yeah, it was kind of likewise in the comics, and like they toyed with it a few times early on, and then I just kind of got bored with it because it's like, well, what do you do with this thing? But like I did wonder whether that was going to come into play as well, but seemingly not.
Optimus Prime reaches for his ion blaster, but is intercepted by cannon fire from a revived Soundwave now. So it's now 3-on-2 in favour of the Decepticons. As he recovers, he being Optimus Prime, sees Bumblebee's remains and starts cradling him. He's in despair. He can't believe what he's looking at. Basically just looking at a cavern where Bumblebee's face was, basically. This is what he's looking at. And at this point, Starscream just kind of appears behind him, gets him in a bit of a chokehold and whatnot, and is just mocking Prime for being so weak and such like that. At this point, Starscream tells Soundwave to help him out. He summons Ravage. And at this moment, Spike and Carly are still in this room. They're seeing everything unfolding. And they start pushing Prime's blaster towards him to allow him to fight back. Carly is, if I remember correctly, is just sort of saying to Spike, the heck are you doing? Like, get back here. And Spike has clearly had a moment of growing up, if you will. And we saw that a few times in the cartoon, Andy, where he just had that moment of, no, this is wrong. Like, I can't do much, but I've got to do something.
Yeah, and the interesting part here is like Carly's point is like you don't even know which side is which, basically. Yeah, you don't know whose side you should be on here, and it's like, well, it seems pretty obvious at this point. Like, one side has tried to protect the humans, the other is just blowing holes in already kind of dead Transformers. Like, you don't need to be a mastermind to figure this out. But yeah, it's a really good moment, and it's kind of nice because it's not a kind of like, oh, the humans do a thing that kind of saves the day completely. Like, it's a small part to play, but it's an important one, and it kind of feels nicely kind of weighted in that sense. So that's pretty good. Let's also talk about how Soundwave just like fires fire from his like shoulder cannon, which I was not expecting. Like, he just sets fire to a bunch of stuff. It's like, that's pretty cool. I didn't know Soundwave could do that.
Yeah, also, the reconstruction moment of Soundwave, it's really cool. It's like he's just you can see him being put back together by Teletran, and there's Skywarp next to him just with the biggest cheesy grin on his face as well. It's so good.
Yeah, I really like all of those panels, like even like Starscream getting kind of reassembled. Like, it looks pretty cool. Because that's a difficult thing. Like, how do you make this look interesting? But they've definitely pulled it off here.
And also, the actual line of dialogue that Soundwave says before he fires the cannon, he says, extermination protocol active. So, again, Andy, a much darker tone from what we have encountered before in our podcast run of doing the cartoons and such. But yeah, that cannon blast was massive. Just so big. But continuing with the synopsis. Left with no choice, Optimus Prime has his blaster, but is clearly outnumbered. Optimus Prime fires at Teletran 1, destroying the computer, thus preventing the remaining Decepticons from being reconstructed. As Teletran explodes, Optimus then grabs Carly and Spike, and he and Ratchet transform and drive out of the Ark into the mountains below. Starscream and Skywarp are now in hot pursuit, but crucially, their Energon levels are low. Jetfire regains consciousness at this point, because he's been left, Andy, so that sucks, quite frankly.
Yeah, Jetfire continuing to have a bad time of it in this reboot so far.
If on your Transformers bingo card you had Jetfire has a bad day, you may check it now. And Jetfire, having now regained consciousness, he goes after them. He transforms, even in his much weakened state. And he fires at Starscream, much to his regret. I think there was a line of dialogue where he pretty much says, "Look what you made me do," because he doesn't want to be involved in the fighting. Starscream volleys back, but critically wounds Jetfire in the process. Fortunately for the Autobots, though, Skywarp begins to run out of energy, and the Seeker Jets are forced to retreat. Needing to recuperate, Spike leads the Autobots into an abandoned quarry, and as he succumbs to his injuries, Jetfire apologizes to Optimus Prime. So much has changed since he left Cybertron in hopes of saving it. Optimus Prime is then about to use the Matrix of Leadership to heal Jetfire, but Ratchet stops him, essentially telling him his injuries are too great. Optimus then grips the hand of his old friend as he passes, still lamenting his failure. And it's got to be said, Andy, I appreciate I breezed through that. The action sequence of all of this, of the Seeker Jets attacking, Jetfire following and whatnot, and Prime driving away, it looks so good on panel. This looked so damn good.
Yeah. I mean, even it kind of has a bit of fun with that, because there's that panel that's like Optimus Prime just kind of running from the explosion, cradling Spike and Carly, and even Ratchet's just like, whoa. It's just like, it's a very deliberate, like, oh, you did the cool, like, running away from exploding thing shot. And it's like, even Ratchet is impressed. But yeah, all of that looks really good. And then, yeah, like, we seemingly have our first confirmed character death, maybe, already.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, as I was reading that, I was surprised to say passing, because I just assumed he was kind of still in a bit of limbo as this issue was ending, so I maybe we'll find out in some post-show notes. Maybe that's been confirmed since by the writer, Daniel Warren Johnson. We'll get to those notes accordingly in a few moments. But we cut back to the Ark. Soundwave reports to Starscream that he is unable to fix Teletran 1, as they both lack the Energon and the raw materials necessary. Until it is repaired, they are the only Decepticons left. So, just for a quick recap, that being Starscream, Soundwave, Skywarp, and Ravage. Though we do see, Andy, in the background that both Reflector and Thundercracker during all this were still being revived as well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and Laserbeak seems like he's
Yes.
up and kicking as well, which I'm not sure whether that means that they were all inside Soundwave and just kind of got auto-repaired. I do enjoy the panels of, like, Soundwave holding Ravage like a cat that wants to get down. And it's just...
Well, don't forget as well, Ravage got attacked when Prime shot the cannon at him, because there was that line where Starscream said, like, rip his eyes out.
Yeah.
As he's holding him in a chokehold.
I'm pretty sure, yeah, like, Ravage is damaged, but it just looks a lot like it's like cat wants to get down. Do not hold the cat right now.
Just gonna get scratched up good and proper. But as you mentioned Laserbeak, Soundwave, we hear, has already sent Laserbeak to scout out possible Energon sources. But the job of harvesting it falls to Starscream, since he has the most Energon reserved. And begrudgingly, as the TF Wiki puts it, Starscream accepts. After all, he is the leader of the Decepticons now. And if by begrudgingly, Andy, we mean the following... Quote from Starscream. I'll do a bad impression of the voice most likely, but just imagine it's Starscream saying it. Go by yourself, they say. Do all the work, they say. Well, I'm tired too. I'm wounded too. And here I am having to do all this by myself. Just such a Starscream moment. It was great.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I mention this is because where Starscream has gone to is where Davy and Sparkplug were working. It's a power plant they were working at, and it's the end of their shift. Davy tries talking to Sparkplug about his recent troubles that we saw at the beginning of the issue, but Sparkplug basically just cuts him off and is not wanting to hear any of it. But they're interrupted by the arrival of Starscream, and he is very, very irritated, as I've just read out, and he's the one having to do all the work. The pair of humans try to escape, but Starscream notices them. Sparkplug is hiding inside the plant, but Davy is not so lucky. He is snatched up by Starscream, who then smiles to himself as he's just starting to crush Davy in his hand a little bit, being amused at how fragile and squishy the pathetic humans are. And the final shot of this issue is Starscream holding Davy, beginning to crush him, just going, and Starscream's going, so squishy. And Davy is just crying out in pain. And all we see is a maniacal Starscream face with the one line of dialogue of, so pathetic. And in blood, the word squish written out, and then to be continued. Oh my god, Andy, what a final panel. I loved this so much.
Yeah, I mean, again, this felt like a very deliberate setting the tone for where this series is going, because it's sort of, you know, it is always the classic Transformers G1 that, like, the Decepticons don't care about humans, but obviously it very rarely wants to go that far with it, you know, for obvious reasons, in the cartoon in particular, but even the comics, you know, it would usually shy away from there being people getting squished. So, yeah, this is very much setting out its stall of just like, yep, we're serious about this, we're not going to mess around.
Now, there's one sort of little line of dialogue that we've not touched on, which no doubt is going to come into play at some point in the near future, because on the arc, I should say, Starscream is basically being told, look, you've got the most Energon, you've got to go sort this problem out. Soundwave says, thus the harvesting is up to you. It's what Meg, and then Starscream interrupts and goes, do not say his name. I am the leader of the Decepticons now. So that was kind of the big thing I alluded to earlier, Andy, is that the only reference to Megatron that we got was barely half of his name.
Yeah. And I mean, there's clearly, like, this is the interesting place where this first kind of chapter leaves things, because, you know, again, the classic G1 starting point is like everybody gets kind of resurrected basically, and you have the full cadre. I mean, it's one of the jokes around the G1 comic was that you had 4 pages of every character like introducing themselves and who they were, of just like a massive text of like, I'm Hound, I'm blah blah blah, which was a really clumsy way of introducing the cast to people. But yeah, you don't get that here. Like, Teletran's been blown up, like, how are the rest of these characters going to get revived? Who is going to get revived? Can Bumblebee be revived? Is he gone already? Like, you know, there's a lot of questions here. And yeah, like on the Decepticon side, what's the deal going to be with Megatron? Because I feel like, again, there's been at least some continuities where there's been sort of an attempt from Starscream to make sure he's not resurrected, but, you know, somebody always steps up and be like, nah, he's the leader, we gotta do this. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out as we move forward with this.
Yeah, and there's sort of various other places we can take the conversation before we get to sort of notes and such and trivia from the TF Wiki, but in terms of a first issue, Andy, I loved this issue. It felt a lot darker than I was expecting, but I got a real kick out of it. And so, small anecdote for you, but when I picked up this issue of the comic, I was in London, and I went to a shop in Camden, a comic shop in Camden Town, Mega City Comics, cheap shout out, and sort of periodically I get to catch up with the folks in there, and he saw that I was picking up the issue and went, I'm interested in reading this. And I was like, yeah, I can't wait to read it. And he went, I'm probably going to wait for the first trade because Daniel Warren Johnson likes to perhaps tell a lot of long-form storytelling. And I just get a feeling I'm going to enjoy it more if I can binge read a bunch of issues. And it was an interesting thought behind that. And at first, my thinking before going into reading it today was, I wonder if I'm going to have that feeling that he mentioned when I was checking out the till. And quite frankly, I didn't, Andy. I'm just hyped to read the next one. And if anything, I will definitely reread this again, or at the very least glance over it again before I read issue 2, because for an impactful first issue, this has covered a lot of ground, it's teased a lot of things. If you're a very long time established Transformers fan, there's lots of little winks and nods to certain things in there. If you're a potential brand new Transformers fan, arguably I'm not sure how accessible this is. Like, say if you're someone who just casually liked the cartoon back in the day and you go into this, perhaps it would be interesting to hear someone's take on it from that perspective. But with that being said, I'm just going on and on. What did you think of this issue overall?
Yeah, I think it's a really good kind of sharp starting point. Like, you know, it hits all the things that you kind of want like a first chapter of a new Transformers story to do. It's like it's introduced the human characters in a way that's very quick and direct and not kind of, you know, overly going into things, but there's still kind of layers left to dig into. You know, it's introduced the Transformers, obviously, but there's still like a lot that it can do. Like, you know, it's in a way it's kind of smart just having this very small subset of characters to start with, because it has a bit of time to focus on, you know, some cool action stuff and what have you, and it doesn't have to go deep on kind of, you know, introducing the characters. And yeah, like I think it's I think if you watched the old Transformers cartoons or anything like that, like, and even if you haven't, to be honest, there's probably enough that you know about Transformers, just cultural osmosis, to be able to pick this up without too much issue. I mean, kind of, I feel like you could probably canvass people on the street and 98% of people could tell you that the Autobots are the good guys, the Decepticons are the bad guys, and who Optimus Prime is. And that kind of gives you enough grounding to enjoy this for what it is, and then, you know, see how it fleshes things out from there. But no, like, it's really strong. You know, it could easily have been a very slow burn of, you know, and again, some of the sort of the IDW comments have done this and gone really deep on like the politics of the Autobots versus the Decepticons, and you know, and you know, that's absolutely fine as a starting point. But for this kind of complete reboot, like, I appreciate that it's gone straight for the jugular, quite literally in places. And you know, I feel like I came out of this being like, okay, I get what this is gonna be, like, not in the kind of very specific form of like where the story is going, but in terms of its approach and, you know, how it's gonna handle things in a more general sense. It's like, it feels like it's kind of given me a bullet point list of all the things that it's probably gonna do.
So here's a fun little thing I might try and introduce every time we go through a comic issue, as it were. So we both sort of read this via Comixology on Amazon, and I decided, Andy, I should have a glance at the reviews on Amazon. So now, again, I don't know sort of in the grand scheme of things what this means, because it's people who have actively engaged and reviewed it, but out of all the people who have willingly gone in and reviewed in some form this issue of Transformers, it's currently got a 4.6 out of 5 rating out of what it says is 281 global ratings. Make of that what you will. Basically, all are 5 stars. Everyone's saying it's excellent. I'll just sort of read out a couple just for a point of reference. So first one, brilliant. Straight out the door, this Transformers brings in a lot of the familiar, but states it is here to take some risks. From the moment the action starts, this version of the Transformers is setting some new ground rules. The art is surprisingly refreshing, and I have to say I am hooked. I would agree. Someone says here, best Transformers comic since the original. Wow, just wow, Daniel Warren Johnson. He has a knack for getting you emotionally invested from page 1. What a way to revive the series. Best comic of 2023, hands down. someone mentioning that the artwork is glorious. Then, Andy, we come to the lone 1-star review of the book. And it's... So, I'll just read this, and we can elaborate more if we want to. Daniel Warren Johnson is a top-notch artist, and that is on full display here, but not a very engaging writer. This book especially seems to rely on some previous knowledge of Transformers. Zero introduction on the characters or factions. It's basically one big long action sequence, but it doesn't matter because we don't have any reason to care for anybody fighting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is the thing. Like, if you have come in completely cold on Transformers, then it's not... Yeah, it doesn't spend any time to explain, you know, why you should care about anybody, barring maybe kind of Spike and Garly a little bit. So yeah, I can see that. Like, you know, I think this certainly, yeah, is not made... Like, if you're not even kind of vaguely curious about Transformers, then this is probably not a good jumping in point. Like, it's certainly assuming that even if you've never read any Transformers or watched any Transformers stuff before, that you kind of you know enough to be sort of just invested by default. So no, I mean, I can't really argue with that as a point of view.
I'd almost be interested to know if that person had read Void Rivals.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't think even that really gives enough context. You know, if you come at it with a completely blank slate, you know, that's probably not enough. Just having a bit of Jetfire there to really kind of add too much to it, because even his cameo is just that. So it's not even like you can be particularly invested in him. So yeah, like it's an opinion that I certainly don't agree with, but I can kind of see where it comes from. So I can't necessarily fault it.
Also, I should clarify my comment about reading Void Rivals in the sense of, did they read Void Rivals, they saw the Jetfire thing, then probably read the bit after from Robert Kirkman saying, see what happens with Jetfire next in Transformers 1, and then did they read Transformers based on that, is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, possibly.
But with that being said, Andy, let's go on to like an official bit of the show now. I'm going to make sure to kind of itemize these in the chapter points and such. Let's look at some additional info and trivia notes about Transformers Issue 1, which there is a fair amount to go into, Andy, because I actually linked this to you earlier today, but Daniel Warren Johnson on his YouTube channel has actually done a sort of director's commentary on the whole first issue. And conveniently, the TF Wiki have already got this kind of noted up and such. That's great news for us, quite frankly. But first of all, continuity notes. Jetfire's arrival on Earth follows his awakening in the first issue of Void Rivals. How long he was asleep exactly is a little unclear. In Void Rivals, he mentions being stranded for millions of years, but he says he was away for merely centuries. Due to the syntax used, it could be that Jetfire was searching for centuries, but asleep for millions. Cybertron's Energon shortage was hinted at. Oh, actually, wait. Andy, I'm going to say now, do we want potential inferring or spoilery things for other issues of the Energon Universe, or are we going to try and sort of read all of these a little bit?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess it depends on what it is.
Okay, what I will say is this. With regard to the status of Energon in this universe, something is alluded to it in Void Rivals 4.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'll say to that. After being attacked by Starscream, Jetfire is seen leaking yellow fluid. This would appear to confirm that the yellow fuel used by Darak and Solila to reactivate him was indeed Energon. I like that as a little continuity point. I had not picked up on that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's truly the Energon Universe.
Soundwave and Starscream allude to the absence of the usual Decepticon leader, Megatron. Where could he be? And then there is a hyperlink on the TF Wiki, which I'm not going to click on because I don't want to be spoiled. Okay, also, Andy, this confirms something we were just talking about. Yes, Bumblebee's really dead.
Cool.
Having been destroyed by Starscream, the other Transformers, including those like Thundercracker, whose reassembly is interrupted, are just offline.
Okay, well, yeah, somebody really didn't like that Bumblebee toy as a kid then.
Transformers references. Like with Void Rivals, this new series draws heavily from the Generation 1 cartoon. The character designs all pull directly from Generation 1. The Ark crashing into the mountain and the Autobots and Decepticons being repaired by Teletran 1 is lifted from the premiere episode More Than Meets the Eye Part 1, right down to one of the Decepticons being reactivated first. The error of the Transformers having their Earth-inspired designs before they receive their Earth alternate modes is also carried over. Next note, Spike, Sparkplug and Carly all originate from the Generation 1 cartoon, though they have been heavily reimagined, especially Carly. Which is actually something we didn't touch on at all, Andy. Like, the character designs, very different than what we're used to.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's a very clear, like, I mean, Sparkplug's probably the closest, but yeah, they're all very much just kind of starting over, which makes sense. You don't want to, make them look too much like the old characters when you're doing very different things with them.
Optimus Prime gains the upper hand over Starscream with a fist and a resounding never, similar to Transformers the movie. Mm-hmm. And then the final note for this particular section, this isn't the first time a new Transformers series launched with Starscream in command in lieu of Megatron. I don't know what that's a direct reference to, admittedly. I could probably find out, actually. Bear with me. This would be... Okay, there's links to 2 here. There's Darkness Rising Part 1 and then Infiltration Issue 1. So
a couple of occasions at least.
There you go. Real-world references. So this may clarify 1 or 2 details, Andy. Sparkplug's flashbacks on the first page of the issue feature imagery of Sparkplug in a conflict very much like the Vietnam War, and the explosion of the space shuttle reminiscent of the Challenger disaster. Based on the context, it seems likely that Jimmy was one of the victims in the latter. Whether these are literally meant to be those events, which one would suggest the comic is actually supposed to be set in the 1980s, or merely stylistic renderings of purely fictional events remain to be seen. Appropriately, Sparkplug is drinking at a VFW bar, which is a Veteran of Foreign Wars venue, Andy, for reference. Mm-hmm. The drunk man raving about having seen a strange aircraft homages a similar scene from the Iron Giant, right down to the character's design. Carly's van features several staples of van murals, such as a wizard inspired by Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings, a barbarian resembling Conan, and a fantasy castle and dragon. Spike's outfit, with a red vest and blue jeans, seems to be pretty heavily based on Marty McFly's classic outfit from Back to the Future.
Yeah, fair.
I'll be honest, I hadn't put 2 and 2 together on that, but fair.
No, I can see that.
So, wrestling reference time, Andy. Remember when Optimus Prime debuts on screen and he basically just does a big lariat kind of clothesline on Starscream? I didn't bring this up in hoping that this might come up, and I'm termed to be correct. Because, fun fact, Daniel Warren Johnson is a big wrestling fan.
It did, yeah. I mean, it did look very wrestling to me, so I was not surprised.
Yeah, and the TF Wiki have actually cited this being the signature move of the Japanese professional wrestler Kazuchika Okada and his move The Rainmaker. Apparently, one of Daniel Warren Johnson's favourite wrestlers.
There we go.
So, there is a lot to go into here, Andy, so I'm just going to forewarn you. We are now delving into storytelling notes. So, bear with me. Let's see how this goes. As both writer and artist on the Transformers series, Daniel Warren Johnson has a rare level of creative freedom while composing the issue and using the art to tell the story. Some of these creative choices were covered in a director's commentary livestream on his YouTube channel. Key insights are reproduced here on the TF Wiki, alongside the TF Wiki's own analysis of the issue. So, buckle in, Andy. We're going to be here for a few minutes. Now, for the purposes of recapping quickly, they now refer to Daniel Warren Johnson as DWJ, so I will start doing the same just to kind of help with flow and such. So DWJ keeps a copy of Magic Square's Light of Peace figure close at hand, which influences his take on Optimus Prime. He notes that he specifically avoids having Prime's boots flare out at all, and he tries to draw them perfectly straight. His primary Transformers comic influence comes from Marvel Comics and Dreamwave Productions. In the case of the latter, we'll note that their opening miniseries prominently featured the Ark 2 disaster, which drew heavily from the real-world Space Challenger disaster. The first page of the story consists of 5 vertically stacked cinematic landscape panels, which spark plugs flashbacks interspersed by a panel of the Ark crashing and of Prime's deactivated body. This gives us an idea of what's been going on through Sparkplug's mind at the bar. In particular, the panel of Optimus Prime is bookended by Spike's off-screen dialogue getting his dad's attention. Prime is often positioned as something of a father figure in wider popular culture. At Hasbro's request, DWJ avoided being too specific as to the conflict being shown on the opening page. He also wanted to streamline the Ark's design to have just 3 rear thrusters, but Hasbro insisted on it having 5. Necessitating the digital addition of 2 more to the later splash page of the ship's engines. Wow.
That's a weird thing for Hasbro to be so specific on. Also weird that they don't want to be specific about the Vietnam War. It's like, I think it's a pretty well known in popular culture. I'm not really sure you can kind of have a position on the Vietnam War in 2023.
The second page aims to bring the story into reality with much more detailed panels of varying shapes and sizes and a muted earthen colour palette. DWJ took reference from several different VFW bars to arrive at the location seen in the comic. As Spike and Sparkplug exit, the cluttered interior gives way to the orange evening sky, with the generous negative space often physically separating Spike and his distant father. I had not put 2 and 2 together on that, Andy. This is going deep.
Yeah, no, some really good art stuff going on there for like panel composition.
DWJ notes that the final panel of this spread is technically wrong based on the perspective of the scene. Spike should be sinking into the ground. This was necessary so as to not obscure Carly's van, which is the same model of vehicle that appears in DWJ's previous original comic series, Murder Falcon. What a great name for a comic. As the earthquake begins, we get the first instance of hand-lettered sound effects drawn into the line art by DWJ. These appear more prominently and frequently as we transition towards comic book action. Apparently, Jetfire is one of Robert Kirkman's favourite Transformers, and his role in the series came entirely from Robert Kirkman's broad strokes outline.
It didn't last very long, did he?
The shock death of Bumblebee was a deliberate choice, as DWJ felt like audiences would be getting a little tired of seeing Bumblebee everywhere. Surprisingly, Hasbro felt the same way, and themselves asked if there was a way to write Bumblebee out of the series.
Okay.
DWJ also apparently doesn't enjoy drawing Bumblebee, which informed the decision, which perhaps doesn't bode well for Cliffjumper, adds a TF Wiki.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess we're also not going to have Goldbug at any point either.
Optimus Prime uses several wrestling moves on Starscream. Should be noted that DWJ previously created the original comic book series Do a Powerbomb, which is very much centrally themed around wrestling. So, there you go.
Yeah.
Prime instinctively knows about his trailer, and its sudden appearance in the story is a riff on classic media where Prime's trailer would often appear and disappear out of nowhere per the needs of the story. DWJ contrived the situation where Spike and Carly need to push Prime's gun into his reach as a way of giving the human characters agency during the action sequence. The skirk sound effect of the gun scraping along the floor is drawn to follow the lines of the action. I'm gonna be honest, Andy, I love comic books. I don't think I've actually delved this deep into something like this before, so it's actually fascinating reading all this.
Yeah, I always find this stuff really interesting, of just like kind of flow of imagery in general. It's the kind of thing that it's easy not to think about, but actually it's really important. And you mess that stuff up and suddenly something that is super legible becomes way less so, and you spend a lot more time processing, wait, what's happening and who's doing what, versus just kind of enjoying the story. And it's really important to not break that immersion. But yeah, I mean, that is a really smart choice, just to give a bit of agency to those characters. It's like we were saying, you don't want them to be the all-encompassing. They make, they make the difference between victory and defeat, but they just have that little part to play that kind of makes them important and not just bystanders.
Ratchet's updated alternate mode came simply from a dissatisfaction with his classic Nissan look.
Yeah, I mean, I did notice that, yeah, that was different. And yeah, like it's OG Ratchet is very kind of boxy and plain, so I'm not surprised. I feel like pretty much every iteration of Transformers, like post original G1, they try to do something with his vehicle mode to make it a little bit more interesting.
I wonder if Ironhide will get a similar upgrade then.
Yeah, probably. It'll be like a Cybertruck or something.
DWJ was keen to develop the Decepticons beyond their classic cartoonishly evil characterization, with a key example in this issue being Soundwave's clear concern for the injured Ravage.
Yeah. I'm interested to see, like if they do some more stuff around that, and even Optimus Prime and Bumblebee, like that's a more obvious thing, but like I feel like that's maybe gonna have further reaching consequences than just like one-off, like, oh no, poor Bumblebee.
For Davy's gruesome death at the hand of Starscream, Hasbro requested it occurred off-panel.
I mean, yeah, like you can't really. I mean, it's bad enough as it is, but
the beat was intended to clearly set the stakes for the comic without being egregiously gory, and seems to also mark a major turning point for Sparkplug.
Yes, yeah. Sure. I mean, if anything's going to drive him to drink more, it's probably going to be that. But
so, other trivia relating to this comic issue. Prior to its official release, an Ashcan copy of the issue was available exclusively at San Diego Comic-Con in 2023. The Ashcan had certain pages taken out to prevent spoilers, as well as featuring concept art and designs for various characters. In early solicitations for the issue, the cover had an original logo with blue text broken over 2 lines. The final cover uses the standard modern logo, leaving some unsightly negative space above Prime's head. This was changed at the request of Hasbro, apparently, as well.
I was gonna say that sounds 100% like a Hasbro request. Like you've got to use the official logo. That's a phrase that rings in my head on a regular basis in my day job. So yeah, sure.
We've both been there, mate, quite literally. And as of October the 2nd, Andy, it was announced that the first issue had sold out at a distributor level even before it was officially released, prompting Skybound to have to announce a second printing before the first issue had even hit retailer shelves.
I imagine they'll be pretty happy with that, so...
Definitely. And also there are a slew of variant covers, quite frankly. So
yeah, of course.
Yeah, make of that what you will. It's a dangerous place if, like me, you are a collector of covers for comics. Trust me. But there we go, Andy. So that was Transformers issue 1. A lot to dive into there afterwards. Honestly, I wasn't expecting us to go as long as we have on this. So it's been really, really good fun. And I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes next, because that was a great first issue.
Yeah. Do we know when the second issue's out? Like, what's the cadence of release for this? Because I'm not...
So I believe it is monthly, if I remember correctly. And I'm going to look up the second issue now quickly. 8th of November is when issue 2 is out.
Okay, so yeah, monthly. Man, that feels like a long wait for like another 30 pages or so, but fine, I'll wait, I suppose.
I suppose one way to look at it, though, is once the Energon Universe is up and running, there will technically be 4 comics going, so then you essentially have a new issue of the Energon Universe every month.
Yeah, it's gonna be it's gonna be a regular thing. But
as you said, though, you don't really want to be reading necessarily everything.
yeah, for sure.
At the very least, then, because I think Void Rivals is 2 as well. So even if you were to go Void Rivals and Transformers, you've then got 2 issues a month, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of fortnightly at that point. But this is just given the end of that first chapter, it's just I'm impatient, basically.
Exactly right, and that's the key detail, isn't it?
Exactly.
Amazing stuff. Well, folks, on that note, as I said, that has been issue number 1 of Transformers from the Energon Universe. When it comes to our next podcast, going to be completely honest, folks, we haven't got an exact timeline for the next one yet. More than likely, we're going to be carrying on talking about the comics, Andy, because I'm well up for talking about this Energon Universe after this.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think we're both going to be reading both issue 2 of this, and I I do need to catch up on more Void Rivals now, having read the first one, to see where that's going. So yeah, I'm sure we will have more to discuss over the coming weeks and months.
Definitely. And as we alluded to in our last podcast discussing the end of Headmasters, sort of going to be going on a bit of a lighter schedule for about another month or so as like work things happen and such. So come around late November, December time, we'll probably be a little bit more regular, and chances are we may delve into some more cartoons around that point. But in the interim, you've got the entire podcast archive to go into should you want to delve into it. You've already heard from us saying that we will be talking about the issue 2 of Transformers, and more than likely we'll be carrying on with at least Void Rivals as well, I imagine. We'll see how that goes and such. But Andy, before we close out proper, anything else you would like to mention to those who have tuned in today?
No, nothing more from me.
Simple as it goes. Folks, from myself, Jeremy Graves, from him, Mr. Andy Hanley, we've been Starscream's Ghost, a Transformers podcast. Here's to the Energon Universe. Until next time, take care.
Bye, everyone.